In the spring of 1942, the Empire of Japan stood at the apex of its power, a colossus astride the Pacific. From the shores of India to the remote islands of the Aleutians, the rising sun flew triumphant. The 6 months following the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had been a relentless, unbroken string of victories. They had conquered the Philippines, seized Malaya and Singapore, and sunk the pride of the British Royal Navy in the South China Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the Teikoku Kaigun, was the most powerful, battle-hardened, and feared naval force on the planet. Its carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, crewed by veteran pilots and led by brilliant tacticians like Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, seemed invincible. Now, the architect of this astonishing success, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, prepared to deliver the final, decisive blow. Yamamoto was a man of immense intellect, a gambler who understood both the strengths and the profound, hidden weaknesses of his nation. He knew that Japan, a nation poor in resources, could not win a long, grinding war of attrition against the industrial behemoth of the United States. His entire strategy was predicated on a single, vital objective: to force a decisive battle, a modern-day Tsushima, that would annihilate the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and force a demoralized America to sue for a negotiated peace, leaving Japan as the undisputed master of the Pacific. His target for this decisive battle was a tiny, strategically vital atoll in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean, an island so insignificant it was little more than a speck of sand and coral. Its name was Midway. The Japanese plan for the Battle of Midway, codenamed Operation MI, was a masterpiece of military art. It was breathtaking in its complexity, its ambition, and its almost arrogant self-confidence. It was not merely a plan. It was a symphony of destruction, a perfectly choreographed dance of naval power involving nearly 200 ships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft, all converging on a single point in the ocean with the aim of trapping and annihilating the American fleet. The plan was a symphony in 4 movements. First, a diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, hoping to draw a portion of the American fleet north. Second, the main invasion force would approach Midway, threatening to seize the island and its critical airfield. Yamamoto knew that the Americans, their backs to the wall, could not afford to lose Midway. They would be forced to respond. And when they did, the third and most lethal movement would commence. Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai, with its 4 veteran fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would spring the trap. This was the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, an elite unit of unparalleled striking power. They would ambush the responding American carriers, sink them, and secure naval supremacy for Japan for the foreseeable future. A final, powerful surface fleet, led by Yamamoto himself aboard the super battleship Yamato, would then move in to destroy any remaining American ships. It was, on paper, a perfect plan. It was meticulously detailed, strategically sound, and executed by a navy at the zenith of its power and experience. It anticipated every American move. It accounted for every contingency. Every Japanese admiral, every staff officer who reviewed the plan, felt a thrill of certainty. They believed they were on the cusp of the greatest naval victory in history. The American fleet was sailing into a perfectly designed ambush from which there was no escape. But their perfect plan had a fatal flaw, a flaw born not of poor strategy, but of absolute hubris. They believed they were moving in secret, that their intentions were cloaked in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. They were wrong. Deep in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, a team of brilliant, eccentric, and sleep-deprived American cryptanalysts, led by the maverick commander Joseph Rochefort, had achieved the impossible. Working with captured codebooks and sheer intellectual brute force, they had partially broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25. They were not reading the Japanese messages like a newspaper, but they were catching crucial fragments, key phrases, and, most importantly, identifying patterns. They knew a massive Japanese operation was imminent. They knew the target was designated AF. Through a clever piece of radio deception, they confirmed that AF was Midway. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the stoic commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now held a hand of cards his opponent did not know he possessed. But it was a weak hand. The Americans were grievously outnumbered. Nimitz had no battleships. His fleet was a battered, patchwork force. His only real striking power lay in his 3 aircraft carriers: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. The Yorktown herself was a ghost, a ship that the Japanese believed they had sunk a month earlier in the Battle of the Coral Sea. She had limped back to Pearl Harbor, grievously wounded, and was now the subject of a near-miraculous repair effort, with workers swarming her around the clock to get her ready for the coming battle. Nimitz placed his 3 carriers in a defensive position northeast of Midway, a place he called Point Luck, waiting to spring his own counter-ambush. But even with the advantage of surprise, the odds were still terrifyingly long. The Japanese had more carriers, more planes, and vastly more experienced pilots. To win, the Americans would need more than just intelligence and courage. They would need a miracle. They would need a moment of pure, unadulterated, chaotic luck. That moment would be delivered not by an admiral's grand strategy, but by the desperate, wandering flight of a single, half-blind American pilot, a man who, at the most critical juncture of the most important naval battle in American history, was hopelessly and completely lost. His name was Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky. And his perfect confusion was about to undo Japan's perfect plan. The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned clear and bright over the Central Pacific. For the men of Admiral Nagumo's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, it was a day filled with the confident, well-practiced rhythm of war. The air hummed with the roar of engines as the first wave of 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the decks of the 4 carriers, their target the small American outpost on Midway Atoll. The pilots were the best in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and Darwin. This was just another routine strike, the opening move in a game they had already won. Aboard his flagship, the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge, the picture of calm authority. His plan was proceeding exactly as scheduled. His scouts were fanning out across the vast ocean, searching for any sign of the American fleet that his superiors in the combined fleet believed was still licking its wounds in Hawaii, hundreds of miles away. Nagumo's only real concern was the possibility of land-based American aircraft from Midway itself, a nuisance to be swatted aside. That nuisance proved to be more persistent than he had anticipated. The American defenders on Midway, forewarned by Rochefort's codebreakers, were ready. Marine Corps fighters, a collection of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of Wildcats, rose to meet the Japanese raiders in a hopelessly brave, suicidal charge. They were cut to pieces by the superior Japanese Zeros. Then came the bombers. Lumbering B-26 Marauders, slow-Vought Vindicator dive bombers, even a flight of 4 B-17s from high altitude. They pressed home their attacks with incredible courage, flying through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of enemy fighters. But their attacks were a tragic failure. Not a single bomb or torpedo struck a Japanese carrier. The Zeros, flown by ace pilots, tore them apart. One flight of 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers was completely annihilated. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, wounded and floating in the water, a lone spectator to the unfolding drama. From Nagumo's perspective on the bridge of the Akagi, everything was under control. His combat air patrol was performing flawlessly, destroying every American threat. However, the American attacks, ineffective as they were, had a critical, unforeseen consequence. The flight leader of the Midway Strike Force, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed a fateful message back to the flagship. The American anti-aircraft fire had been heavy, and the initial strike had failed to neutralize the island's airfield. "There is a need for a second strike," he reported. This message presented Nagumo with his first critical dilemma of the day. His reserve aircraft on the carrier decks were armed not with land attack bombs, but with armor-piercing torpedoes. They were prepared for the main event, the decisive battle against the American fleet, should it appear. Tomonaga's message forced Nagumo to make a choice. Should he wait, keeping his planes armed for a naval battle that might not happen for another day or two? Or should he rearm them with land bombs to finish the job at Midway, neutralizing the annoying but persistent threat from the island? Nagumo, a cautious and methodical commander, made what seemed to be the logical choice. The American fleet was nowhere to be found. The threat from Midway was real and present. He gave the order: rearm the reserve aircraft, break out the land bombs and send the torpedoes back to the magazines. This was a laborious, dangerous, and time-consuming process. On the hangar decks of the 4 Japanese carriers, hundreds of men swarmed over the aircraft. Heavy torpedoes were unbolted from their racks and trundled away on carts. Carts laden with high-explosive land bombs were brought forward. The hangar decks became a chaotic scene of fuel lines, ordnance, and frantic activity. This single decision, born from the courage of the doomed American pilots from Midway, had introduced the first element of chaos into the perfect Japanese plan. The mighty Kido Butai was temporarily vulnerable, its decks cluttered, its striking power in a state of flux. And then, just as the rearming process was getting underway, a second, more shocking piece of intelligence arrived. One of his scout planes, which had been delayed by a catapult malfunction and had left late, suddenly broke radio silence with a terrifying message. Sighted what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. A stunned silence fell over the Akagi's bridge. The American fleet. It wasn't in Pearl Harbor. It was here, right now. Nagumo demanded confirmation. A few minutes later, the scout plane clarified. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. The entire tactical situation had been turned on its head. Nagumo was now in a terrible bind. His first strike wave was on its way back from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land. His reserve aircraft, which he desperately needed to attack the American carrier, were halfway through being rearmed with the wrong type of ordnance. The hangar decks were a mess of bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses. He was caught completely flat-footed. Once again, Nagumo made a series of what seemed like logical, if agonizing, decisions. He ordered the rearming process to be halted and then reversed. Take off the land bombs. Reload the torpedoes. The chaos on the hangar decks intensified. Men who had just spent 30 minutes loading bombs now had to unload them and start the process of reattaching the heavy torpedoes. At the same time, Nagumo knew he had to recover his returning Midway strike force. To do so, he had to keep his flight decks clear. He could not launch an attack until he had landed his returning planes. This created a fatal delay. For a crucial window of over an hour, the most powerful carrier force in the world was functionally paralyzed, its decks a whirlwind of activity, but unable to project its power. Meanwhile, on the American carriers, Admiral Raymond Spruance, now in command of the task force, had received his own scout reports confirming the location of the Japanese carriers. He knew this was the moment. He made a daring, aggressive decision. Launch everything, now. From the decks of the Enterprise and Hornet, dozens of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers and Devastator torpedo bombers lumbered into the air. This is where the American plan began to fall apart. The different squadrons, launching in haste, failed to coordinate properly. The torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, flew low on the water and went in first, without their fighter escort, which was flying at a much higher altitude. They found the Kido Butai. What followed was a massacre. One by one, the American torpedo squadrons from the Hornet and Enterprise were annihilated by the Japanese Zeros. They flew with a courage that bordered on the sublime, pressing their attacks through a storm of steel. Not a single one of their torpedoes hit a target. Of the 41 Devastators that took part in these initial attacks, only 6 returned. It was a slaughter. On the bridge of the Akagi, it seemed that the crisis had passed. The American torpedo attacks had been a complete failure. Nagumo had weathered the storm. His returning Midway planes were now landed. His decks were being cleared. His own powerful counter-strike force, armed and ready, was just minutes away from being launched. The decisive battle was about to begin, and it seemed, once again, that the Japanese were destined for a glorious victory. But high above, lost and running dangerously low on fuel, was Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky and his squadron of 32 Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise. They were supposed to be with the torpedo bombers, but a navigational error had sent them to the wrong patch of ocean. They had found nothing but empty sea. McClusky's orders were to return to the carrier if the enemy wasn't found at the projected intercept point. His fuel gauges were dipping into the red. His pilots were anxiously looking at their watches. By all military logic, he should have turned back. But Wade McClusky was a man possessed by a stubborn gut feeling. He refused to give up. He knew the Japanese were out there, somewhere. He made a decision. A gamble that risked his own life and the lives of every man in his squadron. Instead of turning back, he decided to continue the search. It was at this moment that he became, in effect, a blind pilot. He was off the map, without intelligence, flying on pure instinct. He was a ghost in the system, a random variable that had been introduced into the perfect Japanese equation. And as he scanned the empty blue ocean below, he was about to get very, very lucky. High above the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky was a man facing the imminent failure of his mission. He and his 32 Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise were alone, lost, and bleeding fuel. They had reached the calculated intercept point where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be, but the ocean below was empty. Every minute they continued the search was a minute less fuel they had for the long, desperate flight back to their carrier, a tiny, moving speck in an endless sea. The voices of logic and regulation screamed in his mind, "Turn back." His squadron was his responsibility, and leading them on a pointless search until their tanks ran dry would be an unforgivable dereliction of duty. But the ghost of an idea, a stubborn refusal to accept defeat, haunted him. He knew the American torpedo squadrons were attacking somewhere. He knew the Japanese fleet was out there. He had gambled on his navigation, and he had been wrong. But a gambler who walks away from the table never knows if the next card would have been the winning one. McClusky decided to press his bet. He made another command decision, one that went against the book but followed the instinct of a veteran airman. He initiated what was known as a box search, turning his squadron northwest, hoping to catch a trace of the enemy he knew had to be nearby. It was a shot in the dark, a final, desperate cast of the dice. For 15 agonizing minutes, they saw nothing. The fuel gauges crept ever lower. The mood in the cockpits grew tense. The moment of truth was approaching, the point of no return after which a landing on the Enterprise would be a mathematical impossibility. McClusky was just about to give the final, dreaded order to turn for home when his keen pilot's eye caught something. It was a tiny, insignificant white line on the blue canvas below. A ship's wake. He banked his Dauntless for a closer look. It was a lone Japanese warship, a destroyer, steaming at high speed to the northeast. This was the moment where history pivoted on the decision of a single man. Why was this destroyer here, alone, and in such a hurry? McClusky made a brilliant deductive leap. A lone destroyer, moving this fast, could only be doing one thing: trying to rejoin its main fleet. It was a trail of breadcrumbs. The Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, had been detached from the main fleet to chase down and sink an American submarine, the USS Nautilus, which had been harassing the carriers. Having completed its task, the Arashi was now racing to catch up. In its haste, it was pointing like a perfect, unintentional arrow directly toward the heart of the Kido Butai. McClusky had a choice. He could ignore this single ship and continue his own search pattern, or he could trust that this lone ghost was leading him to the entire enemy fleet. He chose to trust the ghost. He changed the heading of his entire squadron, aligning them with the wake of the Japanese destroyer. He was no longer blind. He was following the scent. On the decks of the 4 Japanese carriers, the mood was one of triumphant relief. The last of the ineffective American torpedo attacks had been beaten back. The slaughter had been immense. The Zeros were rearming and refueling, their pilots flush with victory. The returning Midway strike force was now safely aboard. Admiral Nagumo's flight decks were finally clear. The chaos of the past hour was subsiding, replaced by the purposeful, disciplined activity of a force preparing to deliver a killing blow. The first of the Zero fighters for the counter-strike escort were already being brought up on the elevators. The strike bombers, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, were being fueled and positioned for launch. In less than 10 minutes, Nagumo's powerful counterattack would be airborne, and it would almost certainly spell the end for the American carriers. The perfect plan, after a brief and chaotic interruption, was back on track. It was in this precise, 5-minute window of supreme vulnerability that Wade McClusky and his squadron arrived. Flying at 19,000 feet, they came out of the sun, a position that rendered them almost invisible to the lookouts below. The scene that unfolded before them was a pilot's dream. Directly below, sailing in a perfect, arrogant formation, were not one, but three of the four Japanese fleet carriers: the flagship Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu. Their decks were crowded with aircraft, fully fueled and armed, parked wingtip to wingtip. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Carts of ordnance were everywhere. The carriers were, in effect, floating powder kegs, their defenses momentarily focused on the low-level torpedo threat that they had just vanquished, completely oblivious to the death that was now screaming down upon them from the stratosphere. McClusky's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional, belying the adrenaline coursing through his veins. McClusky to all planes. Target carriers. Follow me. He tipped his Dauntless over into a near-vertical, 70-degree dive. His squadron followed. This was what they were born to do. The Dauntless was not a graceful aircraft, but it was a brutally effective dive bomber, rock solid in a dive, a stable and accurate platform for delivering its 1,000-pound bomb. As they plunged downwards, the whistle of the wind rising to a terrifying shriek, the massive Japanese carriers grew in their sights. It was only then, far too late, that the Japanese saw them. The air was suddenly filled with the black puffs of panicked anti-aircraft fire. But it was useless. The American bombers were already in their terminal dives, committed and unstoppable. McClusky himself targeted the flagship, the Kaga. He held his dive, the carrier's flight deck swelling in his windscreen, until he was sure he could not miss. He released his bomb, then pulled out of the dive with a force that threatened to tear the wings from his plane. He looked back and saw his bomb strike home, a direct hit amidst the parked aircraft. Two other bombs from his squadron slammed into the Kaga moments later. The result was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The 1,000-pound bombs pierced the flight deck and exploded in the hangar below, which was still filled with fuel, ordnance, and aircraft. The Kaga erupted in a series of massive, secondary explosions, transforming from a proud warship into a raging, uncontrollable inferno in less than a minute. At the same time, another division of McClusky's squadron, led by Lieutenant Dick Best, was doing the same to the Akagi, Nagumo's own flagship. A single bomb, perfectly placed, struck the midship elevator and detonated among the armed and fueled planes in the hangar deck. The chain reaction was horrifying. The Akagi, the pride of the fleet, was engulfed in flames, its flight deck peeling back like the lid of a tin can. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, which had arrived on the scene from a different direction just moments after McClusky, performed the same grim work on the carrier Soryu. 3 direct hits turned her into a blazing wreck. In less than 6 minutes, the entire course of the war in the Pacific had been rewritten. 3 of the 4 carriers of the invincible Kido Butai, the heart and soul of the Imperial Japanese Navy, were either sunk or burning so fiercely that they were doomed. Thousands of veteran Japanese pilots and sailors were dead or dying. The perfect Japanese plan had collided with the imperfect, chaotic, and unbelievably lucky reality of war, and it had been utterly shattered. A single, blind, American pilot, who had refused to give up when all logic told him to, had followed a ghost ship across the empty ocean and arrived at precisely the right place, at precisely the right time, to change history forever. The 6 minutes of chaos that had doomed 3 Japanese carriers were not the end of the battle, but they were the end of the argument. From the bridge of his flagship, the super battleship Yamato, sailing hundreds of miles behind the carrier force, Admiral Yamamoto received the shocking, almost incomprehensible reports. Akagi, burning. Kaga, burning. Soryu, burning. His perfect plan, a symphony of naval power years in the making, had dissolved into a cacophony of disaster. The trap he had so carefully laid for the American fleet had snapped shut on his own striking force. But the battle was not yet over. One Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, commanded by the aggressive Admiral Yamamoto, had survived the initial onslaught. Steaming northward through a rain squall, she had been shielded from the American dive bombers. Yamaguchi, a true samurai warrior, was not a man to accept defeat. While the other carriers burned, he immediately prepared to strike back. He would exact a terrible revenge for his fallen comrades. His scout planes quickly located the American fleet, and Yamaguchi launched his remaining aircraft in 2 desperate waves. They found the carrier that had been a ghost on the Japanese damage reports, the USS Yorktown. The Japanese pilots, flying with the skill and fatalistic courage for which they were famous, pressed home their attack through a storm of anti-aircraft fire and American fighter planes. They scored 3 direct bomb hits, and later, 2 torpedo hits on the Yorktown. The American carrier, which had been miraculously resurrected after the Battle of the Coral Sea, was once again mortally wounded, dead in the water and burning fiercely. To the Japanese pilots returning to the Hiryu, it seemed they had at least partially avenged their losses. But this final, defiant act had sealed the Hiryu's own fate. American scout planes, following the returning Japanese strike force, pinpointed her location. A final American strike was launched, a composite force of dive bombers from the Enterprise and even some orphaned bombers from the stricken Yorktown. They found the last of the Kido Butai late in the afternoon. They put 4 bombs into her flight deck, and the Hiryu, like her sisters, was transformed into a blazing funeral pyre. Admiral Yamaguchi, refusing to leave his ship, chose to go down with her, a final act in a tragedy of immense proportions. By sunset on June 4, 1942, the invincible Japanese carrier strike force, the terror of the Pacific, had ceased to exist. All 4 of its veteran fleet carriers were at the bottom of the ocean. With them went hundreds of aircraft and, most critically, the irreplaceable core of their experienced, battle-hardened naval aviators. A loss from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never truly recover. Yamamoto, upon receiving the final news, was forced to accept the unthinkable. His perfect plan was in ruins. His invasion of Midway was aborted. The decisive battle had been fought, and he had lost. The most powerful naval armada ever assembled turned its back and began the long, humiliating retreat to Japan. The Battle of Midway is often remembered as a great American victory, a triumph of intelligence, courage, and brilliant leadership. And it was all of those things. The genius of Rochefort's codebreakers who provided the warning, the strategic calm of Nimitz who laid the counter-trap, the steely nerve of Spruance who ordered the attack, and the incredible bravery of the torpedo pilots who flew to their deaths. All were essential bricks in the foundation of victory. But the battle was also something more. It was a testament to the fact that war is not a science. It is not a perfectly executed plan on a map. It is a chaotic, unpredictable, and often deeply illogical affair. The Japanese admirals had created a plan that was too perfect, too intricate, too reliant on every piece moving in perfect synchronization. It was a beautiful, complex clockwork machine. And the Americans, through a combination of luck, desperation, and stubborn refusal to quit, had thrown a single, unforeseen wrench into its delicate gears. That wrench was Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky. His story is the ultimate embodiment of the battle's chaotic nature. At the most critical moment, he was not an instrument of a grand strategy. He was a blind pilot, lost, off the map, and acting on pure, unadulterated instinct. His decision to follow the lone Japanese destroyer was not based on orders or intelligence. It was a gambler's hunch. And that single, improvised decision, made by one man in the cockpit of his dauntless bomber, proved to be more decisive than all of Yamamoto's meticulously crafted plans. He was the random variable, the ghost in the machine, the single point of failure in a system that had no tolerance for error. The Japanese admirals had a perfect plan to sink the U.S. fleet. They had superior numbers, superior experience, and a strategy that was, on paper, flawless. But they had failed to account for the one thing that can never be charted or predicted: the stubborn, illogical, and sometimes history-altering luck of a single individual who refuses to give up. The tide of the Pacific War had turned, not because of a perfect plan, but because of a perfect storm of courage, chaos, and the incredible, blind luck of a pilot who was in the wrong place at exactly the right time.